Okay, welcome to Medieval Studies at Marlborough College, lecture number 5, the Investiture Controversy. This controversy, as you can see by the dates, runs really over several centuries and in some ways begins well before this 1050 and continues well after 1200. We'll talk about in a couple of days one of the last flare-ups of this division between papal power and royal power, which actually happens after 1300 between the French king and the Pope, and ends up with the Pope moving to France for a period which causes great consternation to a great number of people. But we will come back to that in the future. As you can see in this image, what is at issue is the investing, literally the granting of the symbols of office. And you can see here this figure granting the stole, probably for a bishopric, not clear, but anyway, granting him this sign that he actually is allowed to hold that office. Investing happened in a number of different ways. Knights would be invested by their lords. They would be given the sort of symbol, today we have the very stereotypical touch them on either shoulder with a blade, but what you are in essence doing is giving them some physical mark that they are legal holders of that office, which usually entails certain rights and certain privileges, as well as a certain level of income, a certain set of powers. Bishops, and this is the real crux of the investiture controversy, the Pope never questioned a king's right to make knights or lords, and the kings rarely questioned sort of episcopal prerogative to govern certain aspects of the church. But what was at issue is the assigning of bishops. And just to go back, as we noted last time, under the Ottonian kings in the 10th century, and these are the direct inheritors of the so-called Holy Roman Empire from Charlemagne, the church had really been consolidated in their hands and raised up by them and made more important and made a general part of civic life. And because papal control was so thin in many parts of the north, it had become the habit of many of, in some cases, the local lords, but certainly the emperors themselves, to appoint new bishops. And as we mentioned, going back to Charlemagne, one of the practices that was used was placing daughters or sort of extra members of their household in control of either episcopal benefices for boys, for cadet members of the household, or for daughters, placing them in control of abbeys as abbesses. And this was doubly important because on the one hand, it gave them extended political power, but also many of these church institutions owned and controlled land. So they were ensuring that the land base stayed near to their family, if not directly in the royal purse, as it were. So over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, they had developed something of a habit of assigning bishops from within their circle. Sometimes it could be granted as a favor. And they were really fairly direct overseers of their church. And when they assigned them, they would give them the symbols of their office. They would give them a crook as well as a ring. And the ring tended to signify their respective powers. The crook, or crozier as it's sometimes called, symbolized their power as the leader of their flock of Christian believers, and the ring, a signet ring, symbolized their territorial power and their right to govern the land that they actually controlled as part of their benefice, or the territories that gave income to the church and to the position that were supposed to support the bishop so that the bishop could do their job without having to worry about sources of income. So by the year 1000, the emperor is the one appointing many of the bishops. The ceremony, the investiture ceremony itself, the emperor gives them both the crozier and the ring as symbols of their office, and he's often the one who chooses them. And the Pope at times will confirm them, or sometimes has some hand in it, but that depends on the Pope. It depends on how much the Pope actually gets to Northern Europe. And largely this is in the hands of the emperor himself. So what kicks off this controversy and what makes this a problem is really changes in the papacy rather than changes in the position of the emperor. The emperor has long been seen as the protector of the church and as having a fair hand in this, and certainly, as I mentioned before, as having the right to determine who governs the land in his realm and to have that form of political control. But in the beginning of the 11th century, there are a series of major reformers who come into the papacy and really try to change it. And ironically, all of this begins with a really horrible pope. Pope Benedict IX is one of those notorious, just about as bad as it gets popes, right up there with the Borgias in the 16th century, um, although bad in sort of different ways. And ironically, it's because of this terrible pope that the emperor himself will intervene and put some of these reformers in, and their response and their reforms will then come back to produce this fight with the emperor himself, who actually was responding in the best interests of the church initially. So anyway, back to this really terrible pope, Benedict IX. He is pope from 1032 to 1044, although only sort of, because there's a couple of years there where he is not pope and he comes back. To start with, the office was purchased for him by his father, which is never a good way to sort of start your office as the leader of all Christendom. And actually it's referred to as a sin in later time periods to buy ecclesiastical offices. It's the sin of simony, which we will hear about more in a minute. He himself was the nephew of Pope Benedict VIII, and also seemed to be related to Pope John the 19th. And all of these are popes in the early 11th century. Pope Benedict VIII is pope from 1012 to 1024, John the 19th from 1024 to 1032, and then Benedict the 9th takes over in 1032. You don't have to remember all of these dates. It's just worth noting that all of these popes are kind of from the same family. They're from the same infighting Roman family, and they're getting a little inbred at this point, basically. Peter Damian, who you actually see here on this list, one of these reformers who is going to come in and change things. Peter Damian referred to Benedict IX as a demon in the disguise of a priest. Through his papacy, he resigned once, he sold the office, he was driven out by Henry III, the emperor at the time, twice, and returned to his office. So he sells it, takes it back from the guy he sold it to, driven out by the emperor. The emperor that the pope puts into place dies almost immediately of malaria, probably. We don't actually know. Historical recognition of disease is incredibly difficult, but probably dies of malaria. Benedict IX comes back. Henry III drives him out again. The second pope also dies quickly, and ironically, this is going to happen later. Remember this pattern of German popes being appointed and then quickly dying of malaria. Finally, Benedict IX actually dies, and then Henry III comes in. He has driven him out several times. As I said, directly in the interest of reforming the church. Henry III is actually trying to make the papacy a more respectable organization. And so what he does is he comes in and actually appoints a new pope. So here we have, and note this for a few minutes from now, we have the emperor coming in and trying and appointing a pope, basically saying this last pope was terrible, we need a new and better system of doing this, so I'm just going to pick somebody who I think is really going to have the best interests of the church at heart. So, as noted in this slide, in 1049, Henry III has a synod at Worms, which is in Germany. He appoints a German rather than a Roman. As I mentioned, Benedict, both 8 and 9, and John the 19th are all from these Roman families. And this new pope is Pope Leo IX, listed here, 1049 to 1054. He brings in a whole group of reformers with him, and it's worth noting that many of these reformers bring in a monastic idea. They are not from powerful families. They come from monastic backgrounds and have a new sense of both internal spirituality, but also frugality and sort of austere attitudes that come from monastic living. We're going to talk, when we get to religion, we're going to talk about a monastic revival that actually encourages this in the 10th century. But for now, it's worth noting that this group that comes in has these monastic ideals at heart. Hugh of Cluny, who brings in, Cluny is a monastic group that is part of this revival in the 10th century. He's one of the major leaders of the Cluniac expansion and centralization under their mother house in Cluny. He's not seen as a pawn of local rulers or disputes. He really has control over a wide-ranging network. Hildebrand, the second guy listed here, who, note, Gregory VII will go on to be pope in short order. Hildebrand himself is also a monk, but from Tuscany, from northern Italy. And Peter Damian, who dies in 1072, he does not become pope, but he in many ways is one of the most fanatical of all of these reformers. He actually refused to enter a Cluniac house where Hugh of Cluny came from, because he thought it was too soft, and they thought that their living was far too luxurious. And instead he takes up residence as a hermit. He's later made a cardinal when the College of Cardinals is organized for the elections of popes. And in 1050 he writes a book of Gomorrah, as in Sodom and Gomorrah, in which he condemns a number of practices, including masturbation, homosexuality, some of the ones we might expect, but also simony, the buying and selling of church office, and clerical marriages. And as I noted, this is something that Benedict IX really shone at, as it were. So a central idea of all these new reformers is a sort of universal Christianity that Cluny and some of these other monastic groups are espousing. And in particular, they have very strong attacks on both marriage, sexuality in general, as we saw in Peter Damian, but marriage in particular, and simony. Prior to this, many priests, so there's two systems in the church. There's the monastic system and what is called the secular system, which is not secular, but rather they deal with the secular world. So priests and bishops, priests at parish churches, these are part of a different set of clergy than the monastic clergy. And these reformers come in with a monastic ideal. Monks have always been celibate. Priests have not always been celibate. In the 8th and 9th century, there's plenty of evidence of priests, particularly at the small local level. They have wives, they have children, they have a little bit of property. There are some where they are actually passed from father to son. Occasionally this is done with bishoprics, although really the higher up in the hierarchy you get, the more it's frowned upon. But with the entrance of all of these monastic thinkers, begin to encourage a system for the priesthood and for really all Christians, or as many Christians as they can convince, that celibacy is the proper conduct for anybody in any order, which, as I said, is different from how things had been done prior to that. So with this group of reformers in control of the papacy and of centralized power in the church in Rome, they begin to change how things had been done previously. There were continued efforts in 1054, as you can see, Pope Leo wasn't there for very long, but in 1054, when he dies, Henry III again appoints another pope, Victor II, who was actually only pope for 3 years, but he is a close friend of Henry III. He was actually with him when he died, and was known for defending his rights against many of his barons, so a very close relationship with the emperor, and again somebody more reform-minded. Their efforts made at reform under Leo, they don't go particularly far, and it's really under Stephen IX, and I haven't listed these two because they're not pope for very long. 54 to 57 is Victor II, Stephen IX, and then from 57 to 58, and then Nicholas II from 58 to 61, and it's really under Nicholas II that we get the first major reform in how things are done. Because there are continuing anti-pope appointments, and popes and anti-popes you're going to get a ton of. But needless to say, whenever two popes are appointed, the church generally decides that one is the pope and the other one is an anti-pope. And occasionally you get more than one anti-pope, but that doesn't happen very often. So there are continuing anti-pope papal appointments, usually from Roman families as they were before, and they say, no, no, this is the Pope, but the Emperor comes in and says, no, no, I'm sorry, we're removing that person. We had another synod, and this person has been elected. But under Nicholas II, in order to prevent this in the future, Nicholas II is 58 to 61, just before Pope Alexander II. Nicholas II comes in and forms the College of Cardinals, which to this day is how popes are elected. So it's a group of appointed religious leaders who are supposed to go into a room and vote on the new pope. And the new pope can come from bishops pretty much anywhere in the world. Occasionally it comes from an abbot or monastic house, but often the person has been a bishop prior to that. And this is still true today, although the way that the College of Cardinals works is obviously a little different than it was 1,000 years ago, but the concept is the same, that it's a group of church leaders that are supposed to hold an election for who the Pope is. And in some ways, this election mirrors the way that the Holy Roman Emperor is elected, right? There's some claim to it being a family lineage, but when that isn't working out well, or when there's more than one son and it's being split up in some way, they actually get together and vote. The barons and the family vote on who will be the next Holy Roman Emperor. So the College of Cardinals is formed, and the emperors hope that the hope is amongst the popes at this time that what this will do is remove claimants and anti-popes and the power of the Roman families, as well as sort of arbitrary influence from Germany. So the real tensions then begin under Alexander II. And one last note before we go on with this. You'll notice that all of the names of these reformers, they're all the second of something, right? Victor II, Stephen IX, okay, there's one exception, and Leo IX, but Victor II, Nicholas II, Alexander II, Urban II, they're all seconds because all of these names are names that appeared in the first, second, and third centuries. They're looking to sort of the classical period of Christianity. They're seeing this as a revival of the early church in a way. And as a total sidebar, that's something that actually the Reformation claims as well. This becomes a sort of consistent claim of Christianity generally. But back to Alexander II. So Alexander II becomes Pope in 1061. Henry III, the reforming emperor who really kicked this all off, died in 1056, 5 years before he becomes Pope. His son, Henry IV, is only 6 years old. So this means that you have almost a decade as Henry IV is coming of age without any imperial interference, in which these reformers, even though they were put in place by the emperor, really get free reign of what's going on. With Alexander's election, and again, he's elected by the College of Cardinals. He is the first pope elected by this College of Cardinals. Some of the barons in Germany, and those, including those that are overseeing the youth of the new Emperor Henry IV, refuse to ratify his election. They say that we don't approve of this new body of the College of Cardinals. This is something that the emperors have been doing. Now again, they've only been doing it for 2 popes, 3 popes, and prior to that there isn't precedent for it. But they rebel and elect their own new pope in 1061. So there's an anti-pope and then this pope elected by the College of Cardinals. This continues, and if anything gets worse under Gregory VII. And you'll note Gregory VII is this guy, Hildebrand, the fiery rhetorician, the one notable for writing against simony and clerical marriage. But also, one of the things that he's written about is the undue influence of the political world in the religious world. So he's actually written about exactly this problem of political leaders investing religious leaders, which is not, in his mind, the right order of things, that the religious orders are entirely separate from the political world. So with Gregory VII and the young but growing Henry IV, who, as I said, he was 6 years old in 1056, so by the time Gregory VII takes power, he is in his early 20s and is really beginning to rule in his own right. This is the first major flare-up of the controversy, and Henry IV, again, was raised as a minor by barons who were the first barons to rebel against the decisions of the Pope. Hildebrand himself isn't just notorious for being fiery and unwilling to compromise in any way. So it's with these two that things really get going. I want to just note a couple of things before I talk about what actually happens between the two of them. What you have here is the successor to a pope who was appointed by an emperor taking over an office that he sees historically as having the right to choose or at least anoint or confirm the status of the emperor themselves. Remember the crown that we looked at that has King Solomon on it. King Solomon is chosen by a prophet, is chosen by a messenger of God, which Hildebrand sees himself as in the Pope. So what we're ultimately claiming here is papal right to choose emperors, thereby choosing the ruler of all of European Christendom, and imperial claimants claiming that they have the power to appoint popes and that they are thereby the entire rulers of all Christendom. So this is the final split in the Roman jurisdiction, right? The Roman emperor really had claim to all power, and in the East they continue to exercise it, and they continue to have the right to appoint patriarchs over the church really as they see fit, and they can appoint them or depose them. In the West, these two offices are now split, and both offices are making claims to being able to appoint the other. The one inclination of some sort of compromise comes from a jurist, a legal writer in 1097, a guy named Ivo of Chartres, who claims that the emperor gets to invest the bishop with the ring, meaning their secular authority, but the pope gets to invest them with the crozier, or their spiritual authority. And he sees this as a sort of viable option, but really in the end it doesn't go anywhere. So, turning to Henry IV and Gregory VII specifically, their conflict will culminate at a series of events at a place called Canossa, which is really a sort of great story. And just to remind you, Henry IV is 9 years old when the College of Cardinals is formed, and so is brought up to some extent with the papacy out of his hands, but also with a sense that it should be in his hands. So the College of Cardinals is formed, they begin electing popes. Gregory himself does not exactly have a standard election. They do not consult the German princes on what they want at all. And then once Gregory VII is in power, he has quite extreme claims of supremacy. If you remember the document, the Dictatus Papae, he basically claims that he can do pretty much whatever he wants as Pope because he's Pope. But the real notable event actually comes on the 11th of January in 1075, when Gregory proclaims a hunt for simoniacs. And remember the sin of simony that he wrote about vociferously in this early document when he first got to Rome, is the sin of buying and selling church offices. So he proclaims a hunt for simoniacs. He's going to remove everybody who bought or gained their office through undue political influence and not through sort of genuine love of the church and being a good spiritual person. So a few months after he proclaims this hunt, in July of 1075, he pronounces the deposition of Herman of Bamberg for simony, and this was a bishop who had been appointed by the emperor. Obviously this doesn't go over well, right? He decided that for some reason Herman of Bamberg was appointed for political reasons and not for spiritual reasons, and so removes a bishop that the emperor himself had put into power. In the short term, there's an uprising in the Saxon lands, which actually prevents Henry from responding. He can't fight in two places at once. But on the 24th of January in 1076, under pressure from the German bishops, right? So now the German bishops are worried about their positions because many of them have been appointed by lords or by the emperor himself. And there's a new pope who's basically out to depose them and excommunicate them if necessary. Under pressure from many of these German bishops, a new synod is called at Worms again, and they formally withdraw their support from Henry. So a major group of bishops, most of the German bishops in the north, withdraw their support from Gregory. I said Henry. say, okay, we no longer support this guy as Pope. We don't think he's doing a good job. We don't trust him. So in response, during in a synod during Lent, right? So Henry withdraws his support in January. During Lent, which is a couple of months after that, Gregory formally deposes, excommunicates, and removes the title of emperor from Henry if he does not repent. So he says, okay, you're withdrawing your support. I am excommunicating you. I am declaring you not a Christian. I am declaring you not the emperor. So Henry gathers an army and is going to march on Rome, the same thing that his father did to remove these recalcitrant Roman popes earlier, which didn't work particularly well. But he gathers together an army. He's going to go attack Rome and basically depose Gregory if necessary. Gregory retreats to one of these little lordships, and you remember we talked last time about independent lordships being held pretty much all over parts of northern Italy, southern France, northern Spain. There's a woman named Matilda who has inherited the rights to a castle in Canossa, which is a small territory in the Alps. And she's one of these female rulers that I mentioned. She has inherited it entirely herself and governs it at her will. But she is fairly loyal to Pope Gregory VII. So he actually retreats to her castle, and it is her forces in her castle that says to Henry's army, right, the army of the Holy Roman Emperor, screw you, we're waiting. And Hugh of Cluny is also there with them. If you remember, he is a reformer, but it turns out he's also Henry's godfather. So many of the major players in this retreat to this castle where they know that the emperor will have a harder time militarily than he will coming into Rome and deposing them. Now, the emperor's response to this is really brilliant, actually. At this castle in Canossa, it's high up in the Alps. It's snowing, right? It's March by this, or it's January at this point. So late January, early February, in the snow, Henry shows up at the gates of the castle with no armor on, wearing a repentance shirt and flagellating himself and asking for forgiveness. And this is really a brilliant move because the Pope, particularly a pious Pope like Gregory, can't refuse a request for repentance, right? And this is exactly what Henry comes to him as a supplicant, and the Pope is not really supposed to deny a supplicant of that form. And he stands there in the snow until Gregory opens the door. Letters from the time, although of course this is somewhat legendary history, letters from the time claim that he actually stood out there fasting for 3 days in the snow and nothing but a hair shirt. We don't know if he was actually there the whole time or if he sort of showed up ceremonially every day and actually went back to the village at night. But either way, it doesn't matter. He appeared as a penitent. Gregory finally relents and allows him entry to the castle. And through his repentance, many of the more moderate bishops in Germany, the ones who were really uncomfortable by this tension between the Pope and the Emperor, were really happy that things had at least been symbolically patched up. And so they actually returned to being bishops for the Emperor and the Pope at the same time. But no final arrangement about who actually has control of appointing bishops is reached. So while Henry is the one who looks like the supplicant in this position, in some ways it really buys him time and is a real subtle triumph for his control of things, because he manages to get the excommunication lifted. He's given a little time to consolidate his power in Germany, which is exactly what he does. Eventually, in 1080, a few years after this, Gregory convinces some of the more radical German bishops to elect an anti-emperor. So now we have a real emperor and an anti-emperor, as we had a real pope and an anti-pope earlier. And again, he excommunicates Henry, but the pretender to the throne, a guy named Rudolf of Rheinfelden, is killed in a battle in Leipzig, or a battle near Leipzig, in the Leipzig plain. It's called the Battle of Elster. So In response, in June of 1080, shortly after the killing of the pretender of the throne, the anti-pope Clement III is appointed by Henry and approved by the imperial cardinals, but not the cardinals who are actually in Rome. At this point, the College of Cardinals itself has split into imperial and Roman. But this pope never actually reaches Rome. He's never allowed to get there. In 1084, several cardinals change sides and decide to support Clement. Several of the cardinals who earlier supported Gregory but are getting a little fed up with his fanaticism. But then in Easter of 1084, Clement gives Henry the imperial crown. So here we have a pope appointed again, right, ironically against a reformer. So if you remember, the reformers are put in by Henry III. Gregory VII is one of these reformers par excellence. He's now deposed for being too reformist by Henry IV. Henry IV appoints a new pope, Clement III, who I guess is less of a reformer or the right amount of reformer. Who knows? And in Easter of 1084, again in perfect imitation of Charlemagne, Clement III gives Henry the imperial crown. So we have the sort of complete circle, except the problem that it's an anti-pope. In May, the Normans invade, the Normans in the south of Italy, who will actually continue to be fairly loyal to the Pope for several centuries. And they force Henry and his armies out. But Gregory doesn't have Roman support in Rome itself, and so he actually leaves with the Romans. With the Normans. So to make that a little clearer, Clement gives Henry the imperial crown, but Gregory himself is forced to leave Rome. So there's nobody in Rome. Henry's forces are there, sort of holding it, but Clement still can't get there. Gregory uses the Normans to help him return to Rome, but he doesn't have enough support within the city anymore. He's proved sort of too fanatical for everybody. So he actually leaves to the south of Italy with the Normans and dies there. There's no agreed successor amongst the College of Cardinals as to who should support Gregory VII. So Clement III basically becomes Pope by fiat, although 3 years later the College of Cardinals does get together, and again this is the College of Cardinals loyal to Gregory, gets together and elects Urban II, who is Pope from 1088 through 1099. Although Clement III at this point has been installed in Rome, Urban II is usually considered the true pope. He had both been a Grand Prior of Cluny as well as Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, which is the coastal town near Rome. So he has a really impeccable record. But despite that, he actually calls the crusade in France. We'll come back to the crusade eventually, but Urban II is the one who calls for the first crusade. And it seems like he might have done this in part to support his position as pope. But even at the end of his reign in 1099, he's still not in Rome. It's still Clement III, the anti-pope, who's been appointed by the emperor. So that really brings us to the end of phase one. Just to summarize, Gregory VII goes on the hunt for simoniacs. He's the fanatical pope, and this is really the crux of the matter. He deposes as a simoniac, somebody who bought his office, a German bishop who had been appointed by Henry IV. Henry IV gets angry, claims that he wants to depose Gregory, and gathers together the German bishops to withdraw their support. Gregory responds by excommunicating him. This leads to the whole showdown at Canossa, which Henry sort of wins by fiat, by showing up as a supplicant, buys time, gathers more support amongst the German bishops, appoints this new Pope Clement III. They eventually kick Gregory out of Rome, and he needs Norman help to sort of come back and claim it, although that is not enough. He's driven out of the city. He dies outside of the city, somewhat ignominiously, although he's considered a sort of major reformer of the church. After him, Clement III is in Rome until 1099. Urban II is elected in 1088 by those loyal to Gregory VII. But he also is not in Rome, even at the end of his papacy, which is in 1099. So, bringing us to 1099, there are 7 more years in Henry IV's reign, but in 1099 we get a new pope, Pascal II, and this brings us to phase 2 of the Investiture Controversy. Whereas phase 1 ends in a way that is completely inconclusive, right? We have these events at Canossa that looked a little like an imperial victory in the end, although nobody really gets what they want, and we end with a pope and an anti-pope, and continuing papal and anti-papal problems. Phase 2 is going to end with what looks like a compromise, but which doesn't really last. It's going to end in the Concordat of Worms. And if you remember, Worms is this imperial city where they've consistently held synods, where they've called together imperial bishops, where they've actually elected one of the anti-popes. Initially, everything looks like it might start to improve, particularly after Pascal II is elected, and then Clement III dies in September of 1100. So shortly after Pascal II's claim, shortly after Pascal II's election, Clement III dies, leaving no anti-pope claimant. So Pascal II is generally agreed on by both, so we've solved the last lingering problem from phase 1. However, Pascal II is also a monk who came to Rome under Gregory VII's tenure, so he is definitely reform-minded and more in the radical camp than not. So he gets things started in 1102 by banning all investiture and homage to secular authority. And you'll notice in 1102, this is still Henry IV, right? This is still Henry V's father. Henry IV responds by writing that kings have the direct power to appoint bishops. They have always had this power. He actually produces a bunch of documents proving that Hadrian I had granted this right to Charlemagne, and hence any successive Holy Roman Emperor should also have the right. It's clear now that all of the documents that are produced are actually forgeries, produced in the 1080s in Ravenna, a city that supported imperial power. They're forgeries basically produced by imperial jurists to say, yes, we've always had this right, we know this is true. Although 22 years later or 20 years later, they may have thought that some of them were real, but of course we don't know. But at any rate, this is the claim that they made. So things get more difficult. This produces tension in 1102 and 1103. In 1104, Henry V actually rebels against his father, which Pascal supports. It is somewhat inconclusive. The rebellion goes back and forth, but there's no open battles exactly. And then in 1106, Henry IV dies, and Henry V is elected as he expects anyway. And this causes a real initial reconciliation. Henry V had been supported by Pascal II and sort of generally approves of his policies. And so they get along for the first few years of Henry V's reign. In 1110, Henry goes down to Italy with a huge army and marches to Rome for the regalia, which Pascal II is prepared to grant. He is given the regalia just as Charlemagne was in Rome. Pascal then in 1111 offers a compromise position. It's kind of a compromise. Basically saying that bishops should give up all secular regalia in exchange for the rights of investiture, which is given back to the king. And these are the two documents, the two privileges that I note. And you can see the monastic attitudes, I think, from Pascal II in these two documents from 1111, which really describe him wanting bishops and priests to not be involved in secular matters, right? They shouldn't go to secular court. They shouldn't be worried about land. They shouldn't have sort of any control over land. All church land and city land should be turned back over to the emperor because land control is rightly a secular concern, and the priests and bishops should never have to worry about that. They should only be spiritual leaders. And this is a fairly radical position. It looks like apostolic poverty, as I mentioned briefly. So he's claiming that the church shouldn't have to worry about sort of secular concerns, which of course isn't going to work because the church does take care about secular concerns, and it does own a lot of land, and this isn't going to change that. So on the 12th of February, just before these two edicts are actually finalized, although they have been written at this point, he shows up for his coronation in St. Peter's. The agreements are read, but riots actually ensue, and Henry ends up taking Pascal captive. Now remember, he came for his coronation and was crowned with a huge army, right? So when these privileges are read, people go crazy. They say, no, this is like never how things have been done. This poverty is impossible. So Pascal is a captive, and concessions are forced. And this is the second privilege, right? This is the difference between privilege number 1 on February 12th and privilege number 2. So Pascal reneges, basically allowing Henry to do whatever investiture he wants. And you can see in the second privilege that it basically says, yeah, okay, fine. The Holy Roman Emperor has had this power for a long time. We confirm it. And, seems simple. But in between these two privileges, there's this big army. And then finally, on April 13th in 1111, Henry is crowned in Rome. There are no incidents. Everybody seems happy. However, the Gregorians, right, the people who Pascal II was originally with, and the supporters of Gregory VII, are really furious at this. And in September 1112, at the Synod of Vienne, which is so about a year after these events, things are stewing. The Archbishop Guy excommunicates Henry and threatens Pascal with the same if he doesn't renege on all of these deals. And it's worth noting that Archbishop Guy comes from a family that has an old familial opposition to the emperor. So he's not exactly a fully Gregorian reformer. He has family complaints against the imperial family itself. But at any rate, he excommunicates Henry, threatens Pascal with the same. This doesn't go anywhere. It sort of hangs there. And part of the reason for this pause, there's a pause of about 5 years where this excommunication is hanging over Henry, and the threat is hanging over Pascal II, although they don't go through with that. And this is largely because the papal position becomes very precarious with several Roman families. And you remember the Roman families going back to the horrible pope that kicked all of this off, are threatening to sort of retake over the papacy. They don't like this conflict with the empire. They feel like the popes have been French or German and have not been interested in the city of Rome per se as they were before. And at the same time, the imperial position has become more precarious as princes and Saxon groups begin rebelling, particularly as both groups see weakness, right? The Roman families and the Saxons see these tensions between these two major groups as opportunities for themselves. So despite this sort of bold action in 1112, this puts things on hold. Pascal then dies January 21st, 1118, and his death is an opportunity for the election of more anti-popes, as I suppose we might expect. So Gelasius II, and again another second, was elected by the College of Cardinals, but he actually only survives for 1 year. He's a fairly anti-imperial pope, but doesn't have enough time to do anything. Henry responds by electing his own anti-pope, Gregory VIII. Sort of ironic that he would be named Gregory, but there you go. The successor to Gelasius is actually chosen in France by the cardinals, and Gelasius is none other than Guy of Vienne, the archbishop who originally laid down this ultimatum against both Henry and Pascal. So he is no lover of Henry V. He becomes Calixtus II. There are various attempts at reconciliations, synods, and councils. Henry actually throws one synod in Strasbourg that is overseen directly by his army. I'm sure you can imagine the direction that that goes. However, finally, they actually come together despite the fairly radical position of Guy of Vienne, now Calixtus. This finally culminates in the Concordat at Worms, which you read. And Worms is the imperial city, right? Except the Pope is actually there. It's signed on the 23rd of September in 1122. And this represents actually a genuine compromise. The emperor gets some control of elections. They maintain their influence, so they maintain the capacity to have family members or supporters go to the bishoprics. So they get sort of right of confirmation, if you will. But they give up the actual investiture, the actual ceremony of giving them the ceremonial rite of giving them the staff and the ring. The Pope gets a little bit greater control over episcopal governance as well, so that they get to be the spiritual guide and hence the sort of direct superior of the bishops, which in some ways is a fair claim. And this position actually works for a while, perhaps because we have two people who are fairly set in their ideologies when they're actually forced to compromise. It works for a little bit. So we have 30 years of relative peace between the empire and the papacy once the Concordat at Worms is signed. And you can read the details, obviously, in the document itself. At least, and another thing that helps this relative peace is that Henry and Calixtus die almost back to back. Calixtus in 1124, Henry in 1125. The two people who succeed them are both supporters of the Concordat of Worms. They both essentially saw that as solving a lot of things. They had come to live with it over the course of its first decade. So you have two people who have no personal histories, they have no personal grievances, and they both think that this document is binding. And that lets us go through a couple of emperors and a couple of popes with things relatively peaceful. However, it's not going to stay that way. So those things having happened, on to phase 3. Frederick Barbarossa, again, for some reason the emperors seem to live longer than the popes. I think it's just because popes are elected when they're already pretty old, and emperors, as we saw with Henry IV, can be elected when they're really quite young, even as young as 6. So in phase 3, initially things are plugging along, right? And then Frederick Barbarossa is crowned emperor in 1156. Hadrian IV was crowned pope in 1154. And it's worth noting that during this time period, the holiness of kings has been on the rise. The cult of Charlemagne in Germany is growing. The three kings, the bodies of the three kings that purportedly visited Christ are discovered in Cologne during this time and become a major spiritual site for people to visit. So during this time, the image of a holy emperor and a sainted emperor is actually increasing, which bolsters some of Frederick's later claims, just as a side note. So initially, Hadrian IV and Frederick Barbarossa are both supporters of the Concordat of Worms. They agree to meet and have the usual coronation, restate or renew the Concordat of Worms. As a random side note, Hadrian IV is the only English pope ever. Don't know what good that information will do you, but there you go. But when they first meet for this coronation, again, it doesn't go very well. It's not nearly as bad as the Henry Pascal meeting where the army gets involved, but because of sort of poor etiquette and bad choices about how the day is supposed to run. If you remember, this looks a little like Charlemagne when he goes down, right? He feels like he's not treated particularly well by the Pope, and it becomes this real sort of personal slight, I guess. At any rate, despite that, the coronation does occur. It goes off without a hitch. They renew the Concordat, and Frederick returns to Germany. So, initially, despite sort of personal differences, it looks like things are going to be fine. This really gets kicked off at Besançon, when one of the cardinals and advisors, Besançon is a city in um, sort of region, southern France, northern Italy, that is not nationally affiliated at this time, right? It's in modern day France, except at this time, France was really the area around Paris and further north. We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of lectures. At any rate, a cardinal and advisor to Hadrian IV, the person who will later become Alexander III, right? The person who is going to be pope for 20 years, squaring off against Frederick Barbarossa, because Hadrian IV is only there for about 5 years. His name is Orlando Bandinelli. He's an Italian. Makes the claim that the Imperium, the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire, is only a benefice of the Pope. And this statement, benefice, this term, can mean both a benefit, something that is granted, right? Because the emperor is invested by the Pope, so in some sense he's only stating the obvious. But beneficium, the Italian term, is also a term, or the Latin term rather, is also a term that is occasionally used for fief, right? The actual land that is granted. When I grant you, as we saw between Hugh and William, when one of them is given a piece of territory, that territory is referred to as a beneficium by the lord given to their vassal. So it has this underpinning of saying the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire, that's just a vassalage of the Pope. And as you might imagine, the Germans are furious at this statement. This is how they understand it. Orlando, the cardinal and soon to be Alexander III, acting as legate in 1157, makes this statement, and Frederick is furious. He asks for an apology from Hadrian, eventually forces him to apologize. Tensions continue mounting between the two. At a diet in the imperial city of Roncalia, Frederick issues a number of decrees that manage to enrage both the Pope and the Italian cities. He states decrees about his rights as the emperor and his power over both episcopal politics, but also he places a bunch of imperial ministers directly over the Italian cities of the north. So he's pissing off a bunch of people all at the same time, and this will come back to matter. Milan is so angered that they actually put a ban on the empire and say that he is not allowed to enter the city, and they refuse all tax payments in April of 1159. So tensions are mounting quickly. This is only partly solved, of course, by Hadrian IV's death in 1159, in April of 1159, a few months later. In September of 1159. I'm looking at the wrong date. There's a chance at reconciliation anytime somebody dies, but of course, there's also a chance for popes and anti-popes, which is what we get in this case. We get a schism. Rival cardinal groups, one group of cardinals supporting the empire, one group of cardinals supporting Gregorian reforms. Victor IV is selected as the imperial pope, and as I mentioned, Alexander III, this Italian Orlando Bandinelli, the person who originally wrote that the Holy Roman Empire is only a beneficium of the Pope, is elected as Alexander III. And he is going to be Pope for just over 20 years, which is a fair amount of time. There are going to be 3 anti-popes elected during his term, a couple of whom are going to die of malaria, as usually seems to happen to anti-popes. This happened to the 2 anti-popes installed by Henry III against Benedict IX, if you remember, although Benedict IX was the horrible pope. So the first anti-pope dies within months. and they have a second election, and Pascal III is chosen to replace Victor IV. You don't need to worry about who the anti-popes are. It's the sort of thing that you can look it up on Wikipedia if it really matters. Pascal III also only lives a couple of years, as I said, malaria. This is a fairly serious setback for Frederick, actually, because this allows Alexander III to really cement his support. The cardinal groups that are electing these anti-popes are splintering and getting smaller, so each anti-papal election looks less and less valid, making it look more and more clear that Alexander III is the true pope. And more people begin to support him. Basically, at each election, fewer and fewer people support these anti-popes who are sent to Rome to die of malaria. So it looks more and more like deliberate schism, right? It looks more and more like they're just saying, oh, we won't even acknowledge that guy. We're just going to act in our own interests, and less like a sort of contested election in which there are two valid people who might be the right person. So after the death of Victor IV, Alexander III knows that his position is more solid. He has gained recognition from the French and the English crowns, as well as most of the Lombard cities, who, if you remember, are not happy with Frederick Barbarossa anyway. And he cements his position by excommunicating Frederick, basically for meddling in papal affairs and being a schismatic. He doesn't have to make the claim that Frederick is investing bishops, or to even go back to this old argument. He just makes the claim that he's a schismatic and is trying to install popes who are not true popes. And this looks politically a lot better. So Alexander III is in a fairly strong position. Frederick's response, as is often the response of the Holy Roman Emperors, is to gather the army and march south. The Pope does not flee to Canossa this time. There's going to be no days of waiting in the snow in a hair shirt. He makes it over the Alps and lays siege to Milan and takes Milan by force in 1162. But in 1164, he returns to Germany and is losing control fairly quickly over the northern Italian cities. The death of Victor has been something of a setback. The northern Italian cities, in response to this, form the League of Verona, as they call it, in 1165, and begin refusing systematically to pay all sorts of imperial taxes. They begin demanding privileges of exemption, and this will be particularly important when we talk about city governments next time, as well as the network of Italian trading cities that is developing around the same time, that we'll talk about when we get to the economy. At any rate, this is where we are headed. This is foreshadowing, I suppose, to show you the slide. But in 1165, they form the League of Verona. They force Frederick's hand, and he again gathers his army and returns to Italy. He marches on Rome. He takes the Vatican complex by force, and on July 22nd, 1167, he installs Pascal III. Again, this is the even more contested election, and it looks particularly schismatic of him to install him surrounded by military by force. Disaster almost immediately ensues. There's a wave of epidemic throughout the military, infection and death of many of the military leaders and troops, and so basically they run fleeing from Rome. This could be malaria, although malaria doesn't tend as a disease, side note, doesn't tend to flare up exactly that way, so it's, again, historical recognition of disease, who knows. At any rate, they're dying left and right. It looks like they show up, they take Rome, they're acting as schismatics. This looks very much like sort of God's condemnation of Frederick's actions. So the Lombards in northern Italy, the League of Verona, take the opportunity to rebuild a couple of the cities that Frederick has burned. They redeclare the quote-unquote Lombard League on the 1st of December in 1167 and build a new fortified city called Alexandria, named specifically after this Pope Alexander III, which Frederick cannot think kindly of. And then finally, on the 20th of December in 1168, Pascal also dies of disease. Again, possibly the same disease that the military is dying of, possibly malaria, who knows. So in 1168, having forced this election, having forced the crowning of Pope Pascal III, looking pretty suspicious under the eyes of most of the leaders of Europe, Frederick Barbarossa is forced to retreat with people in his army dying left and right from disease. The northern Italian cities have just created a new fortified city specifically for their defense against the emperor and named it after the Pope who is causing all of these problems. So things are looking pretty bad for Frederick. He retreats back to Germany in 1168, but then in 1174 he decides to force the issue again. So in 1174, and note that in 1174, Alexander III is still Pope, right? He forces the issue by electing a new anti-pope, Calixtus III. And I don't know who at the time could possibly have looked at the election of Calixtus III as anything but a schismatic act. He marches on Italy with an army. He attacks this new city of Alexandria, although he's driven off, despite the fact that it kind of looks like he's going to win for a while. So he breaks off the assault on Alexandria. The 16th of April, 1175, there's a brief attempt at reconciliation between Frederick and Alexander III, which fails completely, and fighting is imminent. So Frederick III's army is marching through Lombardy, and a joint set of armies from the Lombard League from these various cities come out to meet him near Milan. The cavalry meet first, and the German cavalry are quite effective, and the Lombard cavalry are not particularly effective. The Lombard cavalry are routed. Things are beginning to look bad for the army of the Lombard League, and there are 900 footmen, basically, that remain, and they all gather around this cart that has the cross of the Archbishop Aribert of Milan, who is one of the famous saints of the town. So and you can see in this painting, this is a 19th century painting, and it's worth noting, as I say in parentheses, this is during Italian unification, so this is a sort of image of united Italy, right? The Lombard League, a group of cities fighting for their independence against an invasive Germany, which will become quite poignant in the 20th century, really. But this event becomes sort of commemorated through Italian unification as one of these points when Italy bands together against foreigners and they fight side by side. At any rate, there are 900 footmen surrounding this one cart with the Archbishop on it, presumably praying majestically, as we see here with all of the trumpets. It's really quite a painting. These 900 footmen are subsequently known as the Company of Death, but they fight the entire Imperial army to a standstill. The Imperial army is stuck fighting them for basically too many hours, and finally a new unit of Brescian cavalry arrive at the rear of Frederick's army, which the army doesn't know basically until it's too late. The lines that are currently confronting the Company of Death break. The Brescian cavalry find themselves fighting Frederick's personal guard immediately around him. The standard bearer is killed, which basically throws the army into disarray. And Frederick Barbarossa himself is thrown off his horse, and people assume that he's dead. It turns out he's not dead. It turns out he actually walks many miles to a nearby town that is supportive of the empire, and eventually makes his way back to Germany. Frederick has a number of these near-death experiences. Actually, his life is a fairly interesting one. But as the army falls into disarray, he's presumed dead. They're eventually routed, and the rest of them flee back to Germany in complete disarray. Full submission of the empire is forced in Venice in 1177, and Alexander III and his new sort of strengthened papal government look completely triumphant. Um, this is all given full treatment in the Lateran Third and Lateran III documents, and the Lateran is a church in Rome that is the site of several really famous councils. Lateran IV is actually the most famous, but Lateran III issues all sorts of new edicts about how papal elections are supposed to be done. It really removes any imperial power. So this looks very much like a victory for Alexander III and the papacy. Distractions basically prevent further hostilities. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin is quite famous in pick your movie, pick your history book. But the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin encourages Frederick Barbarossa to go off on crusade, which of course the Pope supports, so they have a little bit of reconciliation over this joint venture in which they're sort of ostensibly have the same goal. The new Pope, Urban III, because if you'll note, 1187 is actually after the death of Alexander III. So despite his victory in 1187, the new popes, Urban III and then Gregory VIII, who are the two popes in this time period, both support this crusade. So they're getting along a little bit better, despite the fact that legalistically and according to the sort of official documents produced at these councils, things have really gone badly for the Holy Roman Emperor. So that's plenty long. That is a lot of detail and a lot of information. Let's summarize this a little bit. There are three initial phases. There's going to be a sort of final phase between Benedict VIII and Philip IV, the Fair of France. Philip IV, the Fair of France. It sounds fun to say. Which will be coming up later. As I said, this goes on into the 14th century. But this conflict with Philip IV, Philip IV is not the Holy Roman Emperor, so I've clustered these three together as the sort of core of the fight between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. And the emperors who have this claim going back to Charlemagne, that they are installed by the Pope, but they then are the installers of bishops, and what is their relationship to the Church exactly? So that's what all of this comes down to, right? St. Peter has two keys, often considered one the secular key and one the religious key. And we see these two keys in the image of Otto I, granting a church to Christ himself. The emperor is the defender of the church. They do have rights in church councils. They're supposed to be able to have some control over the election of bishops in their territory. They've certainly done this by long custom. But these new reform-minded, monastic-minded popes have new ideas about how the clergy is supposed to relate as a hierarchy. They create new pretensions of general government within the church, that the church has the right to govern secular affairs, although, as we saw with Pascal in Phase 2, sometimes they try to actually distance the church from secular affairs. So just to review the three phases, the first phase is largely inconclusive, right? We have the events at Canossa, Henry III and his hair shirt, which to some extent ends in an imperial victory. Phase 2 ends in a real reconciliation, the Concordat of Worms, which continues to be an important document governing how the popes and not just the emperors, but other secular rulers and kings will relate to the papacy. And then this third flare-up really ends in a victory for the papacy. And Alexander III, to some extent, is one of the high points of the claims of papal power in Europe. They've spent 100 years of reformers have been busy putting together this new papal political structure and control over the church, which they are then going to lose over the next 100 years, really resulting in the events with Benedict VIII and Philip IV, which we will come back to. So that is the investiture controversy.